My name is Calder Huxley, and my family owns a remote cabin near the northeastern edge of the Northwest Territories, roughly 40 kilometers inland from the Coronation Gulf. The cabin is older than I am, older than my father, and older than every map revision that keeps shaving away or renaming the old trapper routes. I spent most of my childhood summers there, and more winters than I want to admit, because my family insists that the cabin is heritage and responsibility and all the other heavy words people use when something has outlived too many owners. I'll say this up front. The cabin is not cursed, haunted, or touched by anything supernatural, but it is dangerously isolated, brutally cold, and easy to die in if you violate even one of the rules we were raised with. My father called them the winter rules. My grandmother called them the non-negotiables. As a kid, I just called them the reasons I hated going there. But now, as an adult, with the Arctic wind in my face again after nearly a decade away, I understand why the rules matter more than the cabin itself. I arrived this morning, flown in on a bush plane from Kugluktuk before the wind patterns turned unpredictable. The pilot, a friend of my father's, dropped me on the hard pack near the small, frozen inlet we always used as a landing zone. He didn't cut the engine. That's the first sign you're far from civilization. Nobody lingers. He passed my duffel out the side door, nodded in a way that wasn't quite friendly or unfriendly, and took off before my boots even settled. The cold swallowed the sound as fast as the tundra swallowed the heat from the exhaust. From there, it was a 2-hour walk to the cabin. The trail is mostly flat, but the snow was crusted with fresh wind-carved ridges, so I had to watch every step. In the Arctic, a misstep doesn't mean a twisted ankle, it means you lose body heat too fast to recover. My father drilled that into me as a kid. Your mistakes show up later, he'd say. Hours later. Sometimes too late to fix. By the time I saw the outline of the cabin, a faded rectangle against a field of white, I was already thinking about the rules. Not because I'd broken any, but because of how natural they still feel. I've carried them in my head since I was 8. They're simple but strict. And they've kept us alive out here, long enough to hand the place down through 5 generations. Rule 1. Never arrive after dusk. Rule 2. Never go out after dusk. Rule 3. If you see fresh tracks that aren't yours, follow them only in daylight and only until you understand their direction. Then turn back. Rule 4. Never assume a still day will stay still. Rule 5. If you hear anything that sounds like a person, confirm the source before responding. People sometimes laugh at Rule 5 when I tell them. They assume it's superstition. It isn't. Sound behaves strangely out here. A voice can bounce off ice ridges and return warped, or it can travel miles across frozen flats and trick you into thinking someone is right behind you. The rule doesn't come from fear. It comes from people freezing to death while chasing echoes. When I unlocked the cabin door, I half expected the hinges to scream, but it opened cleanly. My father must have oiled it during his last winter here. Inside, the air was stale but familiar. The wood stove sat where it always had, black and squat and dependable. The bunk frames looked untouched. Even the hooks by the door were exactly where I remembered leaving my coat on the last trip. I lit the stove first. Out here, you always heat before you settle. Cold has a way of creeping into your bones and numbing the part of your brain that knows your fingers are stiffening. Once the fire crackled, I unpacked the essentials: sleeping bag, food rations, tools, a compact emergency beacon, and the notebook with every rule written inside the front cover. My father made me copy it by hand when I was 12. Said I'd remember the rules better if I inked them myself. I wasn't supposed to come alone this time. My father planned to meet me here yesterday, but his flight connection through Yellowknife got cancelled due to wind, and the morning flights were delayed. The idea was to do a full maintenance check on the cabin together. He told me on the phone not to come without him, not even by a day. But today is my only window, and the cabin hasn't been checked since last season. Once the fire settled into a steady burn, I stepped outside to assess the fuel shed. Just a quick look, enough to confirm the supplies hadn't been compromised. The shed looked fine from the outside, drifted snow up one side, gaps in the slats from typical weathering, nothing unusual. Then I noticed something I shouldn't have. Fresh tracks. Not mine. Not from an animal. Too straight. Too even. Human. Leading away from the cabin. The snow around them was crisp, untouched by wind, meaning they were made very recently. I checked my watch. It was just past noon. Full daylight. Long enough before dusk for a margin of safety. Still, my throat tightened. If someone had passed by, why come so close to the cabin? And why walk away instead of knocking? I crouched and examined the prints. Full weight impressions, narrow stride, slightly angled outward at the toes. Someone walking alone, not in distress, not in a hurry. But there was something else, something I didn't want to admit I saw at first. The tracks came from the shed, not from the direction of the inlet or the old trapline trail or anywhere that made sense. They led out into the open tundra, into a direction where there's nothing for 50 kilometers. And Rule 3 hit me the way an icy wind hits cheeks already frostbitten. Follow only until you understand the direction. But I already did. They were headed into empty land. Which meant one of two things. Either someone was lost, or someone didn't want to be found. I followed the tracks only far enough to confirm what I already suspected. The direction didn't change. They led straight across the tundra, unwavering, like whoever made them had picked a point on the horizon and refused to look anywhere else. The snow was firm beneath my boots, the kind that holds shape long after each step leaves it. I crouched again, comparing my prints to theirs. Mine had the heavy, compacted edges of someone carrying gear. The strangers were lighter, shallower, as if the person wasn't dressed for the cold or wasn't carrying anything at all. That bothered me more than anything. Nobody walks out here without gear. Not unless they're making a fatal mistake or they don't plan on needing to come back. A gust of wind rolled over the plain, lifting a thin veil of powder. Not enough to blur the footprints yet, but enough to make me check the sky. High clouds, faintly teal, moving northeast. They weren't thick, but they were fast. And fast clouds meant fast weather. Rule 4, never assume a still day will stay still. I straightened, stared across the empty land one more time, and forced myself to turn back. The tracks tugged at me in the worst way, not curiosity, but unease. They shouldn't have been there. They shouldn't have led away from shelter, and they sure as hell shouldn't have started from the fuel shed. But following them any further would have been breaking Rule 3, and breaking rules out here isn't something you survive by improvising your way through. When I got back to the cabin, my hands were already stiff. Not from the cold, I had gloves, but from tension. I closed the door, latched it, and exhaled in a slow stream through my teeth. The stove crackled reassuringly in the corner. The interior smelled like warm wood and thawing old dust. A place that should have felt safe. It didn't. I put on a pot of snowmelt to boil and checked the radio. It was a small, rugged set, manual dial, built for emergencies. I turned it on, listened to the static hiss, and sent a quick status ping to the nearest ranger outpost frequency. I didn't mention the tracks. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want the question that would follow, were they yours? And the explanation I'd have to give, no. Someone was already here. The radio crackled back a moment later with a garbled acknowledgement. Nothing useful. Nothing concerning. I set it aside. I told myself the most likely explanation was simple. The pilot had checked the shed before I arrived. Maybe he'd stored something there temporarily. But two problems hit me immediately. First, he never shut off the engine, meaning he didn't have time. And second, his plane had landed at least 100 meters from the shed. If he'd walked there, his tracks would have stretched back toward the inlet. They didn't. The pot hissed. Steam curled upward in thin white ribbons. I poured a cup of meltwater into a metal mug, letting the heat thaw the tension in my fingers, and walked to the window. The tracks were still there, undisturbed. And then I noticed something else. Something I hadn't seen earlier because I'd been focused on where the tracks were going. There were no tracks leading to the shed. Only tracks leaving it. Meaning whoever had been inside arrived long before the last snowfall. No, there wasn't an or. Not one worth thinking about. My father always said the tundra plays tricks on tired minds, but I wasn't tired. I'd slept fine last night in Kugluktuk. My head was clear. My boots were steady, and the daylight was sharp enough to cut with. Still, I stepped away from the window. Watching the tracks too long felt like staring at a problem I wasn't ready to solve. I grabbed the key from the hook and made myself go check the shed properly. If someone had broken in, I needed to know. And if the door was damaged, I'd have to repair it before nightfall. The wind picked up again as I crossed the short distance. The shed leaned slightly to the left, the same way it had since I was a kid, from decades of frost heave. I worked the latch, stiff but functional, and pulled the door open. Everything inside was exactly where it should have been. Fuel drums stacked, tools lined up, emergency rations sealed. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed, except for one thing, the axe. It normally hung on the back wall. My father always kept it there, blade wrapped, handle oiled, easy to reach in an emergency. But now the peg was empty. The axe wasn't on the floor. It wasn't on the shelf. Someone had taken it. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling my heartbeat move from normal to measured concern. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. I stepped further inside. The shed smelled like diesel and dry wood. My breath clouded in the cold air. I checked the corners, the space behind the stacked drums, the small loft shelf where old spare parts collected dust. Nothing. Just one missing axe and one unexplained set of footprints. Outside, the wind gave a low, dragging whistle along the shed wall, the kind that sounded too much like a distant voice. I ignored it. Wind out here can mimic anything if you let it. I closed the shed door and locked it. Not because I expected someone to come back, but because leaving it open felt wrong. Exposed. As if I'd be inviting something, not someone, to step inside. When I returned to the cabin, I checked the latches again. Twice. Then I stoked the stove, added fresh wood, and forced myself to breathe slowly. The footprint direction made sense. The missing axe made sense. The shed being undisturbed made sense. But all three together didn't. Not in any way that lined up. I sat at the small wooden table, mug in hand, and listened to the settling creaks of the cabin. I'd heard them all my life, the way the boards groan gently as they adjust to heat. But today they sounded different, sharper, more alert, like the cabin was listening too. Night wouldn't fall for a few hours yet, but dusk comes fast in the Arctic, and I wasn't alone anymore. The hours between noon and dusk always feel shorter out here, like the light itself knows what's coming and doesn't want to linger. I kept checking the window more than I should have, not because I expected the tracks to disappear, but because I half expected new ones to appear beside them. Nothing changed. The wind brushed loose snow against the ridges, but it wasn't strong enough to erase anything yet. I told myself I needed to keep working. Maintenance was the reason I'd come, after all. Sitting and staring out the window would only make my mind manufacture explanations I didn't need. So I grabbed my toolkit, layered my gloves, and stepped back outside to inspect the generator casing on the east side of the cabin. My father's last note about it, scribbled in the margin of the rule notebook, said the bolts were stripping. Not dangerous, just something to tighten before they wore down further. I knelt in the snow, metal biting through the fabric of my pants as I leaned in and started checking each bolt one by one. Halfway through, a faint crack of snow behind me made me freeze. I didn't turn immediately. The cold has a sound, and so does movement across it. This sound was light, controlled, not like a fox bounding or an owl landing. More like weight shifting onto packed snow. Footstep. I counted one slow breath, then another, before turning. Nothing. Just wind skimming the flat white distance. The shed in its place. The sky growing more metallic by the minute. But something was off. It took me a moment to place it. The tracks I had seen earlier, leading away from the shed, looked subtly different. Not changed. Just extended. Maybe a meter. Maybe two. But enough that I didn't need to question myself. I hadn't walked that far out. And I hadn't taken a single step in that direction after returning from the shed. Someone else had. My throat tightened. I scanned the terrain with the focus of someone who's suddenly aware of how small they are compared to the horizon. The Arctic gives you nowhere to hide, but paradoxically, it gives you every direction to disappear into. I forced myself back to the generator. I tightened the bolts faster than I should have, double-checking each one with hands that didn't feel fully steady anymore. When I finished, I circled around the cabin, making a quick inspection of the walls, stovepipe, slats, and window frames. Everything was intact, but the feeling wasn't going away. Nothing about the tracks made sense. Even if someone had been there before snowfall, their prints wouldn't be crisp. Even if someone had been passing through, they wouldn't have walked past the cabin without knocking. Even if they'd entered the shed for shelter, they wouldn't have walked out empty-handed but taken the axe. I returned inside and locked the door. Not out of fear, doors don't stop cold or wildlife, but because my instincts told me to create a boundary. Something between me and whatever was shifting in the snow outside. The cabin warmed slowly as the stove consumed more wood. I checked the time. 3:42 p.m. dusk approaching. Shadows lengthening. I took out the rule notebook and set it on the table. I wasn't planning to read it, I know every line, but opening it grounded me. The inked handwriting of my 12-year-old self stared back, shaky and uneven, but precise enough. Beneath Rule 5, my father had added a note in his own handwriting years later. If you hear something unusual, verify the conditions around you. The land speaks before danger arrives. I closed the notebook. Outside, a low rumble vibrated through the cabin walls. Not loud, not close, just present. The kind of vibration that travels far across frozen ground. The movement of heavy air or shifting ice. Nothing abnormal, but it slid under my skin anyway. I went to the window again. The tracks extended a little farther. Not much. Just enough to notice. And they were fresher now. Sharper around the edges. Someone was out there, moving slowly, deliberately, while keeping their distance. I reached for the binoculars hanging on the window peg. The landscape snapped into clearer focus through the lenses. Every ice ridge, every ripple in the snow, every exposed patch of wind-hardened crust. Nothing. No silhouette. No figure. Not even a flicker. But the tracks didn't lie. I kept scanning. A full sweep. Then another. I forced myself not to blink for longer stretches. The tundra stared back, blank and indifferent. Then I noticed something near the distant end of the prints, barely a shadow, barely a shift. Like heat distortion in a place far too cold for heat. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was an absence, something that didn't reflect light the way the snow should. But when I blinked, it was gone. I lowered the binoculars slowly, breath fogging the glass. My heart was beating harder now, not fast but heavy, like each pulse needed more room than my chest could give it. I heard movement again, a faint, deliberate crunch. This time from the other side of the cabin. I pushed away from the window and moved silently toward the back wall. My boots made soft thuds against the wooden floorboards. The sound outside paused as if whoever was there, or whatever, had heard me too. I reached the rear window and lifted the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. The snow was smooth, untouched, but the sound had been real. I stayed there for a long moment, pulse hammering in my ears, until the wind picked up enough to cover every subtle noise outside. The Arctic always feels big, but right then it felt close, as if the distance wasn't empty, only watching. I stepped away from the window and grabbed the emergency radio again. My voice stayed low but steady as I sent another ping, then added, "This is Calder Huxley at the Huxley cabin. Possibly not alone out here. Requesting confirmation of any ongoing expeditions or passing travelers." Static. A faint crackle. Then a partial transmission. "No one. Route. Stay. Cabin." The line died. I stared at the radio for a long second, then set it down with slow, deliberate care. Outside, the sky dimmed further. Dusk was coming fast. And whatever was out there was getting closer. By the time the sun dipped low enough to stain the snow a bruised pink, I'd shut every curtain in the cabin. Not because I thought it would hide me. Nothing about thin fabric hides anything out here, but because I didn't want to keep catching movement in my periphery. Curtains turned the landscape into a known quantity. For walls, 1 room, 1 stove, my breathing, nothing else. I kept thinking about the radio transmission, the incomplete words, the clipped static, the unmistakable warning tone in the ranger's voice, even though the actual message was broken. No one, route, stay, cabin. That meant no scheduled expeditions, no maintenance crews, no locals passing through, no hunters, no rescue units. Nobody. Whoever made the tracks hadn't come from anywhere sanctioned or expected. And whoever was still out there was definitely not meant to be. I checked the axe peg again, even though I already knew what I'd see. Empty. My father always said the axe wasn't for danger, it was for practicality. For ice cutting, wood splitting, emergency digging. The fact that someone had taken it meant 2 things. They'd entered the shed deliberately, and they knew enough to steal something actually useful. That terrified me far more than the prints themselves. I layered my coat and hat, then moved to the kitchen counter where we kept the old flare gun in a tin box. It wasn't a weapon. It was a signal device. But signal flares can scare off wildlife, and sometimes people too. I loaded it and set it beside the stove. The cabin creaked again, louder this time, a groaning shift of wood that vibrated through the frame. Normal. Entirely normal. Warm wood expands, cold wood contracts, and the temperature difference between the heated interior and the Arctic air outside always creates tension. But the sound immediately after wasn't normal. A muffled crunch, close, right outside the wall. I froze mid-step. Another crunch, slow, controlled, like someone shifting weight from one boot to the other. I backed away from the wall instinctively, every nerve sparking. The cabin was small enough that only 1 or 2 strides separated any 2 points inside, but I moved as quietly as I could toward the window nearest the front door. I nudged the curtain aside by a centimeter. Nothing. Snow ridges. Faint twilight glow. The shed. The stillness of a world that swallows noise whole. But the tracks, God, those tracks were different again. Not longer this time. Closer. A new line branched off from the original path, angling toward the far side of the cabin. Someone was circling. My breath tightened so hard I tasted metal on my tongue. I stepped away from the window and killed every light except the stove. Darkness wrapped the cabin in an instant, leaving only the faint orange glow dancing across the floorboards. Shadows stretched in slow, trembling lines that made the whole place look alive. I didn't want to think about that. Instead, I grabbed my boots from near the door and set them on my feet, not tying them yet, just preparing. If I needed to move quickly, laces would only slow me down. Running outside at dusk violated Rule 1 and Rule 2, the biggest rules of all, but something deep in me, older than caution, was whispering that staying inside wasn't necessarily safer. I was halfway through pulling on my left glove when a new sound cut through the air. 3 sharp knocks. Not on the door. Not on the wall. On something wooden outside. Something hollow. My stomach dropped as the realization hit. The shed. Someone was knocking on the shed. I moved to the window facing that direction without thinking. The curtain's edge fluttered between my fingertips as I lifted it just high enough to see. I expected to spot a shape. A person. A shadow. Instead, the shed door was open. Wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I was sure of it. I had locked it. I remembered the feel of the latch, the resistance, the click. Inside, I could see the faint outline of the shelves. Still orderly. Still intact. But the missing axe hung over everything, a silent accusation. A figure was nowhere in sight. I lowered the curtain slowly, pulse shaking through my hands. The axe wasn't the only tool in the shed. There were shovels, saws, rope, and enough hardware to take apart half the cabin if someone wanted to. Someone had opened the shed. Someone had taken the axe. Someone had knocked on it just now, as if to announce their presence. And someone was smart enough to avoid being seen. I backed away. My body knew the cabin's layout by instinct, and it shifted me toward the stove, toward the flare gun. The room felt smaller now, not cozy, compressed. Like the walls were leaning in to listen. The radio crackled suddenly, a burst of sound that made me flinch. I lunged for it and lifted the receiver. "This is Calder Huxley," I said, voice too tight. "If anyone can hear me, I have an unknown individual near the cabin. Possibly armed. Requesting." Static drowned my words. A faint pop cracked through the frequency, followed by something that sounded like a distorted breath. Then silence. I set the radio down with shaking fingers. The silence that followed was heavier than anything yet. It stretched out, thick and unmoving, as if the tundra itself were holding its breath. Footsteps. Very close. Crunching in a steady rhythm toward the front porch. I didn't look at the window. Couldn't. My whole body locked up as a slow shadow passed across the small strip of light at the bottom of the front door. Whoever it was stopped directly in front of it. I held my breath until my chest burned. The door handle moved. Not violently, just a slow, testing shift downward. Twice. Like someone was trying to figure out whether I had locked it. I swallowed hard. Then, finally, the handle stilled. Silence again. A long, excruciating silence. The kind that lets you know you're being watched. I didn't move for nearly a full minute after the handle went still. Every muscle locked, suspended between fight and freeze. The stove crackled softly behind me, the only sound in the room that didn't feel invasive. The Arctic outside had turned into a vacuum, a world holding itself perfectly still so I could hear every faint shift in the snow, every whisper of fabric, every slight disturbance of air. Whoever was on the other side of that door was either waiting for me to make a sound or deciding what to do next. I stayed crouched beside the stove, one hand hovering near the flare gun. It wasn't much, but it felt better than being unarmed. My father always said the flare wasn't for shooting at someone. It was for shooting through the fear. A way to grab control of the moment. A way to create noise, light, distraction. Right now, distraction felt like a luxury. The shadow under the door didn't move. The silence stretched, pulled tight. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, I heard soft snow crunching again. The figure stepped away. Not far, just a slow walk down the porch steps. I heard the creak of old wood, the kind that always gave out a low sigh in cold temperatures, and then, nothing. The snow swallowed the sound completely. I waited for more footsteps, more prints to appear in my peripheral vision through the curtains. But there was nothing. They were either standing still just out of view, or they'd retreated into the dimming twilight. Neither possibility comforted me. I waited another slow minute before creeping to the front window. I lifted the curtain only a fraction of an inch and held my breath. The porch was empty. The snow below showed a new set of prints, fresh ones, leading a few meters out and stopping abruptly. Not continuing, not branching, just stopping, as if the person had vanished into thin air. But strictly realistic meant I couldn't indulge that thought. They hadn't disappeared. They'd moved sideways, or backward, or toward a blind angle. The land has ways of hiding people even though there's nothing to hide behind. Snowdrifts create false depth. Light plays tricks. The mind fills gaps. Still, the abrupt stop made my skin crawl. I pulled the curtain back into place. Night was coming fast, thick blue shadows blanketing the horizon, dimming the sky into a sharp silver haze. The temperature would drop at least another 10 degrees soon. Rule 2, never go out after dusk. I wasn't about to break it. I added more wood to the stove. The flames surged, lighting the cabin with a brighter glow. The warmth was good, but it made the outside feel even colder by contrast. I tried the radio again. Static. Then a faint pulse, like a heartbeat in the frequency. Nothing useful. The prints outside stayed in my mind. The missing axe. The shed door left open. The person moving quietly enough to circle the cabin without being seen. And the one question that kept repeating: why hadn't they tried to break in? If someone wanted gear, warmth, shelter, anything, they would have forced the door already. Out here, nobody plays nice when survival is on the line. If they wanted to hurt me, they wouldn't have tested the handle gently. They would have used the axe. Their restraint scared me more than aggression would have. A predator shows itself. A desperate person makes noise. But someone patient? Someone silent? That's the kind of person who has a plan. I found myself drifting toward the back door, the one almost never used. I listened, ear against the wood, breath held. The faintest draft slipped through the seam, but no sound. No shifting. No footsteps. The idea of someone simply waiting outside was unbearable. I backed away again, heart pounding. I needed more information, more certainty, more ground under my feet. Every instinct screamed to do something, but the rules pinned me in place. Then something unexpected happened. A soft metallic clink against the porch. Not loud, not aggressive, almost gentle. I went to the window again, lifted the curtain a sliver, and squinted through the darkening light. There was something lying on the porch. Metallic, half buried in fresh powder. I stared hard. The wind brushed a thin veil of snow off it, revealing the shape more clearly. A compass. My compass. It had been inside my pack earlier. Buried deep. Protected. Someone had opened my pack. Someone had taken it out. Someone had set it on the porch like a message. I felt the heat drain from my body in an instant. The meaning struck fast and hard. Someone had been inside the cabin earlier, before I arrived. It explained the footprints that only led away. It explained the missing axe. It explained the shed door open without tracks leading to it. It explained everything. Whoever was out there had been inside the cabin before I landed, from before snowfall. They must have slipped out when I was busy, maybe during the walk from the inlet, or while I checked the shed. The cabin had felt undisturbed, but disturbances don't always look dramatic. Someone careful can return everything to its place. Someone who didn't need warmth, didn't need food, didn't take rations, didn't steal the stove tools, only the axe, and the compass. Those weren't random choices. A compass shows direction. An axe gives leverage. And leaving the compass outside wasn't a threat. It was a signal, a warning, or a hint. My pulse thudded in my throat as I stepped back from the window. The rules were meant to keep us alive. They'd saved 5 generations of Huxleys. But there was no rule for someone who'd already been inside. No rule for someone who didn't want shelter. No rule for someone who wasn't trying to come in, but trying to draw me out. The stove crackled. The walls creaked. The wind hissed past the cabin like a whisper held too close to the ear. A soft knock. Not on the shed. Not on the cabin. On the window. Right behind me. I didn't even turn around at first. The knock was so soft it could have been mistaken for settling wood or shifting frost. Except it had rhythm. Intent. 3 gentle taps, evenly spaced. Not random noise. Not weather. A human gesture. My body reacted before my mind did. Every muscle locked, my breath stopped, and a shallow, electric pressure spread across my skin like the cold had crawled indoors and touched me directly. The window behind me was only a couple of meters away, but it felt like a cliff edge. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't dare give the sense of any reaction at all. Another tap. Lighter this time. Almost testing. My throat tightened. Slowly, so slowly I could hear my joints protest. I turned my head just enough to catch the edge of the window in my peripheral vision. Nothing. The curtain fluttered faintly from the stove's heat, but there was no silhouette. No approaching shadow. The knock had been perfectly placed, like the person outside knew exactly where to tap so I wouldn't see their outline from inside. A deliberate choice. Every step they'd taken so far had been deliberate. I stepped back toward the center of the cabin, putting distance between me and every wall. The flare gun was still on the stove ledge, right where I'd left it. I picked it up, holding it low, not raised, not threatening, just there. My pulse throbbed in my palm. A whisper of snow brushed the wall on the outside. Then quiet. I strained my ears until the silence became a weight pressing against my eardrums. Footsteps. Slow, moving along the exterior wall, brushing against the boards. Not trying to be silent now. Not hiding. Walking a slow circle. I swallowed hard and tried to stay rational. A real person out here, someone in this cold, walking calmly around a lit cabin, would have to be layered in gear. Heavy boots, fur or insulated synthetic at least. They'd move stiffly, leaving deep prints. They'd want heat. Shelter. None of this matched. I found myself backing toward the table. Instinct told me to anchor my back against something solid, but instinct also warned me that putting myself in a corner was a mistake. So I stood in the open, where I could pivot in every direction. The footsteps stopped just beneath the back window. Then nothing. 5 seconds. 10, 20. The silence thickened again, wrapping the cabin in a cold, breathless hold. Then a new sound broke it. A rasp. Thick, metallic. It came from the shed direction. A dragging sound, like metal scraping gently against wood. The axe. They were dragging the axe. My vision prickled at the edges. Not panic, just the body's primal alarm kicking every sense into overdrive. I moved to the window facing the shed and lifted the curtain a hair. Nothing but darkness. The sky was fully dim now, blue giving way to near black. The shed door was still open, but I couldn't see movement. A shadow flickered across the snow. Not a shape, just a shift in the faint light. I dropped the curtain instantly. They were too close for comfort, too comfortable out here, too coordinated. I needed information, and right now, the only place I might get any was the radio. I grabbed it, pressing the call button, voice shaking despite my effort to stay steady. This is Calder Huxley at the Huxley cabin. Unknown individuals circling the structure, possibly armed. Anybody on frequency, reply. Static. The pop. Then, just barely, another broken transmission. It's not alone. Then silence. The last 2 words hit harder than the knock had. Not alone. I didn't know if they meant I wasn't alone inside, or the person outside wasn't alone. Either way, dread pooled in my stomach. I checked the cabin again. Stove corner, bunks, pantry, loft shelf. No signs of entry. No disturbance. The interior was exactly as I'd left it. And yet, that didn't calm me. Whoever took my compass had been inside earlier. They could have been inside for minutes. Or hours. I tugged open the narrow cabinet next to the bunks. Empty. Just tools and emergency blankets. I crouched to check the space beneath the lower bunk. Too small for anyone. I checked the loft shelf again. Dust undisturbed. Nothing. A new sound outside, closer to the front door now, made me straighten sharply. The crunch of snow under shifting weight. Then a soft, steady exhale. Not animal. Human. Right on the other side of the door. I didn't dare approach. I stood frozen, flare gun ready, muscles trembling. A second exhale. Then a third. Slow. Controlled. Deliberate. They were standing there, breathing just loudly enough for me to hear. Not knocking. Not testing the handle, just letting me know they were there. My skin crawled. Then, the breathing stopped, followed by silence so complete it felt intentional. I stepped back toward the center of the cabin again, trying to picture the footprints outside, the direction they'd taken, the way they'd stopped abruptly in places. I forced my mind to stay logical. Someone out here must have had prior access. They knew the land. They knew the cabin layout. They moved quietly, but confidently. They weren't freezing. They weren't desperate. They weren't acting like a lost person. They were acting like someone waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for me? Or waiting for nightfall? The hair on the back of my neck stood straight as another detail hit me. They had the axe. Not swinging it. Not threatening with it. Just dragging it. Slowly. Keeping their pace matched to dusk. It wasn't aggression. It was timekeeping. A signal of how close night had come. Because the moment sunlight vanished completely, the rules changed. The rules said never to go outside after dusk. They said nothing about someone else using that same dusk as cover to decide their next move. I clutched the flare gun tighter and stared at the door, waiting for whatever came next. But nothing came. No footsteps. No breath. No knock. Just cold pressing against the cabin, settling in the walls, deepening the silence until it felt like a presence itself. Someone was still out there, listening, watching, waiting, and night had finally arrived. Once full darkness settled over the tundra, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The faint glow from the stove cast long orange bars across the floor, warping the shadows so they stretched and curled like slow-moving things. I stood in the middle of the room, flare gun in my hand, listening for any sound. Footsteps, breathing, scraping, anything. But the silence outside was too complete, too absolute, the kind that turns the world into a vacuum. A person shouldn't be able to move silently in fresh snow. Not in deep cold. Not at night. The crust always cracks. Powder always shifts. Yet whoever was out there wasn't making a single sound anymore. They were waiting. I could feel it in my bones. The stove popped sharply, and I nearly fired the flare gun out of reflex. My nerves were on a razor's edge. I forced myself to slow my breathing. The rules existed for moments like this. Never go out after dusk. Out there, you lose control. Out there, the land eats your mistakes before you know you've made them. Inside, at least the cold couldn't touch me. Or so I kept telling myself. The radio crackled again. Just a faint static pop, like something brushing the frequency. I snatched it up, desperate for any kind of human voice. Station HQ, please respond. I whispered, voice tight. Unknown individual near my location. Possible previous entry into the cabin. Request. A burst of distortion cut me off. Not speech. Not static. A low hum. Steady. Mechanical hums. It wasn't coming from the frequency. It was riding under it, as if something was interfering with the signal itself. My skin prickled. That shouldn't happen, not out here, with nothing but open land, no towers, no lines, no equipment within hundreds of kilometers. Then the hum stopped abruptly, replaced by an unmistakable click. A microphone button. Someone pushing it. Someone listening. My breath hitched. And then, stay inside. The voice was faint, distorted, barely audible through static. But I knew it wasn't my father. It wasn't a ranger. It wasn't anyone I recognized. But don't. The transmission cut out completely. My grip tightened on the radio. I wanted to squeeze it until the plastic cracked, just to release the pressure building in my chest. I set it down slowly, carefully, as if the act of putting it down too fast would make sound loud enough to bring whoever was outside closer. The cabin popped again. The wind brushed lightly against one wall. A whisper of drifted snow tapped the window. A scrape. Not metal. Not the axe. Wood on wood. A single dragging stroke along the side of the cabin. I jerked toward the sound before I could stop myself, heart hammering so hard it felt like it shook the room. Another scrape. Higher this time. along the siding as if someone was running a hand or a tool slowly across it. The flare gun felt useless in my hand. Its weight was small, almost delicate for a moment like this. I backed away from the wall, keeping my eyes on it like something might press through the wood. When the scraping stopped, my ears strained for the next sound. But instead of noise outside, something else grabbed my attention: movement inside the cabin. A faint shift of air from above. I glanced up. A narrow ceiling hatch sat near the small loft shelf, an access door to the crawl space under the roof. Something we used only during repairs, never casually. A place nobody should be. The hatch wasn't fully closed. It hung, maybe half a centimeter, ajar. I stared at it, frozen. Had it been like that earlier? I hadn't checked. I hadn't even looked. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt too tight. The hatch swayed slightly, a soft creak of wood under shifting weight. Not wind, the crawl space was sealed from drafts. Not heat, the stove wasn't strong enough to swell the boards. Something up there had moved. My mouth went dry. The footsteps outside had stopped. The scraping had stopped. The unnatural silence pressed inward. Slowly, I stepped back until my heel touched the far wall. I lifted the flare gun, not aiming at the hatch but trying to feel like I had some control. The hatch creaked again. Just a whisper. And then, a soft thud. Something inside the crawl space shifting its weight. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, a strange surge of panic and disbelief. Whoever had been outside wasn't outside anymore. They were inside. In the ceiling. They must have entered earlier. Maybe while I was out at the shed, or tightening the generator bolts. They climbed up through the loft shelf, or pulled themselves through the wall slats. I'd checked the room, but I hadn't looked up. My father's voice echoed in my head. Danger announces itself twice. First with distance. Then with silence. A soft, shuddering exhale escaped from above, barely audible, but too close, too real. Not animal. Human. Breathing slow, controlled. Trying not to be heard. My hand trembled as I tightened my grip on the flare gun. I backed toward the stove. A central position, a place with light, heat, and at least some visibility. The hatch shifted, a subtle, almost gentle movement, followed by the faintest touch of wood against wood, like fingers resting lightly on the panel. Just once. A single tap on the inside of the hatch. A quiet, deliberate confirmation. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't mishearing. Someone was up there. Snow brushed the exterior wall again, but I barely heard it. My heartbeat filled the room. A little firmer this time. The sound vibrated through the cabin's wooden bones. I forced myself to breathe. Slowly, quietly. The rules told me to stay inside. The rules told me not to engage at night. But there were no rules for someone hiding above my head. A new sound came from the crawl space. Fabric shifting. A zipper. A bag? Clothing? I couldn't tell, but the person wasn't moving toward the hatch. They were rustling around. Organizing something. Preparing. Something cold tore through me. Then, a final sound. A foot sliding back. Redistributing weight. Positioning. Whoever was up there wasn't coming down. They were settling in. Like they planned to wait out the night. Just as calmly as I did. I stayed pressed against the wall for what felt like forever. The flare gun clenched so tight my knuckles went numb. Above me, the crawl space had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Whoever was up there wasn't pacing, wasn't fidgeting, wasn't shifting their weight anymore. They had gone completely still. Stillness meant control. Stillness meant intent. Stillness meant they were waiting for something specific. I forced my breathing to shallow, to soften, to match the silence. I didn't want them to hear anything from below. I didn't want them to know where in the room I stood, or if I'd moved at all. But every second stretched thinner, more fragile. The cabin creaked once, an ordinary temperature pop, but it startled something in me anyway. Instinct made me lift the flare gun toward the hatch without thinking. The ceiling panel wasn't fully closed, but the gap was too small to see through. Just a sliver of darkness that shouldn't have been there. I tried to think logically. Whoever this was had been inside earlier today. Before I arrived. Before snowfall. They'd taken the axe. They'd taken the compass. They'd entered the crawl space with intention, which meant one thing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a lost traveler. This wasn't desperation. This was calculated. The sudden, sharp discomfort of that thought made my stomach knot. I backed toward the stove again, the closest thing to safety. The warm light gave me enough visibility to watch the hatch and both doors at once. My father always said the stove corner was the heart of the cabin, where you observe everything without exposing yourself to the windows. Another creak from above, the softest pressure shift. My pulse surged. Movement outside. A faint crunch in the snow near the back wall. I froze, torn between two impossible realities. Someone was still outside. And someone was still inside. Not alone. The voice on the radio hadn't been wrong. A shape moved past the window, just a blur of shifting shadow through the curtain. I ducked reflexively, breath halting. Whoever it was moved with a slow, casual rhythm, like they weren't cold. Like they weren't rushed. Like they knew exactly what they were doing. The interior of the cabin tightened around me, the walls feeling closer with every second. My chest felt too small, squeezed inward by panic I didn't want to admit was building. A new sound came from inside the crawl space, something subtle but distinct. Fabric. A small shift. Weight distributing once more. Whoever was above me repositioned themselves in response to the footsteps outside. Not startled. Not alarmed. Coordinating. Realization hit me so hard I felt my knees weaken. The two people weren't acting independently. They were acting in sync. I lifted the flare gun again, but I wasn't aiming anymore. I was holding on to it for sanity, something solid to grip. The warmth from the stove brushed my side, making the trembling in my arms feel even colder. Another crunch outside. Then a faint tap on the window glass. Not loud. Not forceful. Just a fingertip. A testing touch. I backed fully into the far corner, putting the stove between me and the window. I kept my eyes on the hatch because the idea of something dropping down from above felt worse than the idea of something pressing against the glass. Two more light touches. Then silence. I reached for the radio again, hands shaking. Station HQ. If anyone at all is listening, there are multiple individuals near the cabin. One inside. One outside. My voice cracked. Please respond. Please. Static. A long, distorted exhale through the speaker. Then a whisper, not spoken clearly, but carried across the broken frequency like a breath caught in the machinery. Don't open the door. Then the radio went dead. The flare gun suddenly felt heavier in my grasp. I wasn't planning to open the door, God, no. But hearing the warning made dread pool deeper in my gut. The radio wasn't connected to anything dangerous. Interference shouldn't produce words. Someone had to be transmitting. Someone nearby, or someone relaying. And that meant I truly wasn't alone out here in any sense. I forced myself to check every corner of the cabin again, just with my eyes, not moving too far from the stove. The shadows in the room had sharpened, stretched by the low angle of the firelight. Each corner looked deeper than it should have. The walls felt thinner, the ceiling heavier. The crawl space hatch creaked again. This time, the sound was deliberate. 3 soft, distinct movements. A slide, a press, a tiny, purposeful shift of wood. Whoever was up there was no longer trying to stay still. They were testing the hatch. Not to open it, just to remind me they were there. I swallowed hard, the tension closing my throat. Something colder and sharper settled in me, something that felt like a realization that had been waiting the whole time but only now found the nerve to surface. The rules weren't meant to keep whatever was out there from getting in. They were meant to keep me from going out. Because going out meant leaving the controlled environment of the cabin. And leaving the cabin meant stepping into their environment. The person outside. The person above. Both waiting for the same thing. A mistake. A sound. A shadow. A movement toward the door. A reaction to their taps. A break in rhythm. Any misstep in this frozen silence. My grip tightened. The stove popped loudly, wood splitting with a sharp crack. I flinched so hard I almost fired the flare gun. A shift above. A whisper of fabric. A hand brushing wood. The person in the crawl space reacted to the noise. But not like it startled them. More like they were studying it. Then another sound outside. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Circling back toward the porch. They were moving in tandem again. Coordinated. Waiting. Waiting for me to choose wrong. The flare gun felt small and warm against my palm. I stood there, trembling, breathing as quietly as I could, trying to think of a way out, a way through, a way to follow the rules and still survive. The crawl space hatch shifted. Just a centimeter. On purpose. Someone above me had finally decided to come down. The hatch moved only a centimeter, but that was enough. No wind could do that. No temperature shift. No settling. Someone up there had deliberately pushed it. I raised the flare gun toward the ceiling, arm trembling so badly the barrel wavered. The small orange glow from the stove flickered across the hatch, casting a thin shadow through the gap. I stared at that sliver of darkness like it might breathe. Another soft sound came from above, someone shifting their knee or elbow on old wooden boards. A controlled movement, not in a hurry, not clumsy. Whoever was in the crawl space was taking their time, adjusting their position, lowering themselves toward the opening inch by inch. My mind raced. If they dropped down, I'd fire. The flare would blind them for a second, maybe longer. But then what? The flare gun only had one round. Once I used it, I'd be holding an empty shell while someone recovered and closed the distance. Footsteps outside started up again. Slow, crunching, circling the cabin in the same steady rhythm. They weren't trying to distract me. They were syncing with the person above. Every few steps, a scrape on the siding. A long drag across the wall. A reminder that both sides of the cabin were covered. 2 people. One above. One outside. Patience like stone. The hatch shifted another fraction of an inch. Not opening, just testing. Just confirming the range. The angle. The drop. I backed up until heat licked my shoulders from the stove. My breath came out in sharp, thin clouds. My pulse was too loud in my ears, drowning out everything else, until the radio crackled again, startling me so hard I nearly fired by accident. A faint voice flickered through the static. Calder, don't engage, stay light. Then a burst of interference and silence. Stay light. Light? I glanced at the stove. Bright, steady flames. The only source of illumination in the cabin. I didn't understand what the voice meant. Keep the fire bright? Keep the lights on? The phrase rang in my ears but didn't resolve into clarity. Outside, footsteps crunched closer again. The person was directly beneath the back window now. I heard them exhale, a slow, steady breath that fogged the glass from the outside, dimming the faint reflection of firelight. The inside of my chest tightened painfully. They were close enough to breathe on the window, close enough to hear my pulse, close enough to... The hatch above me scraped again, this time more firmly. A hand pressed against it, testing its resistance. My options collapsed into a single thought. If they dropped down, there would be no space, no time, no distance. I stepped sideways, keeping the flare gun pointed upward while angling myself toward the small side table. On it sat my pack, partially unzipped. I hadn't opened it since discovering the compass was missing. Something inside the pack shifted as I brushed it with my leg. I froze. That wasn't possible. Everything inside should have been exactly as I packed it. Slowly, never lowering the flare gun, I reached down with my free hand and opened the pack completely. Inside, beneath my clothes and gear, lay something metallic and unfamiliar. A piece of old rusted hardware, flat, circular, part of a hinge or trap mechanism. Heavy and ice-cold. Not mine. Not from the cabin. Placed there by someone. A weight. A reminder. A sign. I didn't understand the meaning, but I understood the timing. Whoever put it there wanted me to find it now. A soft series of taps came from the ceiling hatch, this time 3 in a row. A signal. The person outside responded a moment later by crunching the snow twice, deliberately. They were communicating, coordinating their next move. My breathing grew shallow. The flare gun quivered in my grip. The heat from the stove felt hotter, sharper, as if the cabin itself sensed the moment tightening. Then something in me snapped into clarity. Not panic, but a strange, cold resolve. The rules. Every one of them existed for a reason. Rule 1. Never arrive after dusk. Rule 2. Never go out after dusk. Rule 3. Follow tracks only until you know their direction. Rule 4. Never trust still weather. Rule 5. Always confirm a human voice before responding. None of the rules said what to do if someone was already inside. But they didn't forbid the one thing I hadn't considered. Make yourself harder to reach. My father's words came back suddenly, vividly, spoken years ago when we practiced emergency drills at the cabin. If you can't leave safely and you can't defend safely, you change the ground beneath the danger. Change the ground. I moved fast. I stepped to the stove, grabbed the heavy iron poker, and jammed it deep into the fire. Flames flared around it. I waited 5 seconds, long enough for the poker to glow faintly at the tip, then swung it hard at the cabin's cast iron stovepipe. A sharp metallic clang exploded through the room. The entire cabin vibrated. Above me, the crawl space occupant shifted violently, unexpected, unbalanced. The hatch rattled as elbows or knees jerked against it. Outside, footsteps broke their rhythm, rapid, crunching suddenly as the person ran toward the sound. I struck the pipe again. And again. Loud. Metal ringing like a warning bell sent straight into the bones of the cabin. The person in the crawl space scrambled, losing the silence they'd held so carefully. I heard a thud, a knee or elbow slipping, the quick, startled breath. The person outside crashed into the wall, fists or boots hitting the siding in agitation. I disrupted whatever coordination they had, thrown off their timing. forced them into reaction instead of planning. I swung the poker one more time, the loudest strike yet. The hatch slammed shut. Not from above. From the force of their own weight shifting. The lock clicked back into place from pressure. I stumbled backward, flare gun raised again, heart pounding. Outside, footsteps retreated quickly, toward the shed, toward the darkness beyond it. I heard the crunch of snow diminishing, farther and farther away. The cabin settled back into silence. The crawl space was still again. No breath. No movement. Whoever was up there had frozen completely. But they hadn't come down. And they hadn't moved since. I backed toward the stove and stayed there until dawn. When daylight finally bled across the horizon, pale and thin, I checked every part of the cabin. The hatch was sealed. The person above had left during the night, silently. The tracks outside were scattered, irregular, heading far out across the tundra until they disappeared into wind-carved drifts. The axe lay half-buried near the shed, dropped as if abandoned in haste. I didn't chase them. I didn't follow. I didn't break the rules. I left the cabin as soon as the light was fully up, radio strapped to my chest, flare gun in my hand, walking back toward the frozen inlet where I'd been dropped off. Behind me, the cabin stood silent, empty, but not safe. Some rules keep you alive. And some rules exist because someone, a long time ago, found out what happens when you break them. I never went back. Not once. Not ever.